You know, what does it actually mean to be injured? It sounds like such a simple question, right? But a landmark legal case in the UK revealed just how complicated that answer can be. This single case completely redefined the meaning of harm, and believe me, its decision is still felt by thousands of people today.
And this is the paradox, right, at the heart of this entire story. It feels like a philosophical question, but for a group of industrial workers, it was intensely, painfully real. Is it possible to have suffered a harm that deserves compensation, even if you feel perfectly fine?
Okay, so to really get this case, you need to know about something called pleural plaques. Basically, they're scars on the lining of the lungs that are caused by breathing in asbestos fibers. And here is the crucial point, the one detail the entire case hangs on: they are benign. They don't cause cancer, they don't cause breathing problems, they don't cause any physical symptoms at all. They're just a silent marker that you've been exposed. So let's talk about the actual people involved here, because this wasn't just some abstract legal debate. It was about the lives of workers who had no idea they'd been exposed to a hidden danger for years. This timeline really just drives home the cruel nature of asbestos-related issues. You have men being exposed way back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. For decades, they just lived their lives completely unaware of what was inside of them. It was only much, much later, thanks to modern scanning tech, that these pleural plaques were even discovered, and that's what led to this huge wave of legal claims in the early 2000s. So here was the worker's dilemma. Imagine a doctor tells you that you have these plaques, but you feel fine. No pain, no shortness of breath, nothing. But you know these plaques are hard proof that you breathed in asbestos, the very same stuff that causes these horrible, fatal diseases. That knowledge created this profound, absolutely crushing anxiety. And this phrase just perfectly captures their state of mind. Can you imagine being told you have this permanent internal marker that means you're at a higher risk of a deadly illness? You can't see it, you can't feel it, but you know it's there, always. The constant worry, the fear for what the future holds, it's literally like living with a sword hanging over your head. That psychological burden, that was the harm they said they'd suffer. So as you can imagine, this completely new situation sparked a massive legal fight. Employers and their insurance companies argued, hey, without a physical illness, there's no injury to pay for. The whole question just baffled the legal system, and it led to these totally conflicting judgments. So the whole thing for the courts boiled down to this one very specific question. You have a physical change, the plaques, which are harmless, and you have psychological distress, the anxiety, which is very, very real. So when you put those two things together, does that cross the legal line to become an injury that someone has to pay for? And the courts were just completely split. It was a real legal tug of war. At first, the High Court actually sided with the workers. They agreed that, yes, the physical marker plus the anxiety counted as real damage. But then the Court of Appeal came in and totally reversed that decision, ruling that harmless plaques were not damage in the eyes of the law. The whole case was at a total deadlock.
So, with the lower courts at a complete standstill, the case climbed all the way to the top of the legal ladder, the House of Lords. This was it, the final word. And their decision wouldn't just end this one fight, it was going to set the legal definition of damage for generations to come.
And the verdict was decisive, unanimously. Every single one of the top judges in the country agreed with the Court of Appeal. The presence of benign pleural plaques, even with all the anxiety they caused, was not a compensable injury in the eyes of the law. So, you're probably wondering, how did they get there? Well, let's break down their reasoning. First, they said that for something to count as legal damage, it actually has to be harmful. Since the plaques have no bad effects on the body, they just don't qualify. Second, they made this really critical distinction. The plaques are a marker of exposure, not a cause of future disease. And finally, they stuck with a long-standing legal rule that anxiety or psychiatric distress, by itself, if it's not tied to a physical injury, generally isn't something you can get compensated for in a negligence claim. Now, this decision reached far, far beyond the men in this one case. It became what's known as the Rothwell precedent, and it fundamentally changed the whole landscape of personal injury law in the UK. So, what is a legal precedent? Well, it's basically when a high court makes a decision, and that decision becomes the rule book for all the lower courts. They have to follow it in any future cases that are similar. So the House of Lords' decision wasn't just an opinion, it became the law of the land.
And the impact was wow. It was immediate and it was immense. Thousands of other workers who had similar claims had their cases stopped in their tracks or thrown out basically overnight. For this specific condition, the door to compensation was slammed shut.
So, when you boil it all down, the key takeaways from this landmark case are pretty clear. First, it sharply defined what personal injury really means in the eyes of the law. Second, it drew a very firm line in the sand between a harmless physical change and one that is actual, actionable damage. And third, it reinforced this really high bar for claiming compensation for purely psychological suffering. It was a ruling that, in the end, prioritized a strict physical definition of harm over a more subjective emotional one.
And that leaves all of us with this lingering, really complex question. The law drew a firm, clear line based on physical harm. But the Rothwell case really shines a light on that tension between a legal definition and the actual lived experience of suffering. In an age where we can see more and more inside our own bodies, discovering risks and markers we never even knew we had, how should we, and how should the law, define what it truly means to be harmed?